James Paterson, a Liberal Senator for Victoria, is someone who's kept a very close eye on these issues. He's been very critical of China's attempted interference in Australian politics, and I caught up with him earlier today. Senator James Paterson, thanks for joining us. The Foreign Relations Bill before Parliament looks like being made this law. Will that be the end of Daniel Andrews' Belt and Road Agreement with Beijing?
Well, Chris, the government hasn't indicated exactly which agreements it would choose to terminate should it be given the power to do so by the Parliament. But if we're up to me, speaking as a backbencher, that would be the first on my list because I think it very clearly contravenes the objectives set out in the Foreign Relations Bill, which is to make sure that Australia's national interests are consistent and set from Canberra. And very clearly, the Prime Minister and others have said that Victoria's entry into the Belt and Road Agreement is not consistent with the national interests. It breaches Canberra's strategies and plans for our foreign relations, and it is not the place of a state government to be involved in such things.
Now, in my mind, this bill is a very important one. All it does really is clarify, reaffirm the constitutional power of the federal government over foreign relations rather than allow that to be undermined by the states. And you must be encouraged, at least, that in broad principle, federal Labor supports that.
Chris, the most consistent feedback I've received from the electorate, from my constituents about this bill is, oh, we thought that was the case already. Why on earth have you not already enacted a bill like this? Why was this not already the law? So I think it's a pretty simple proposition, and I am pleased that the Labor Party has committed in principle to the overall objective. They have suggested they're going to move some amendments to the bill, but they've also agreed that if those amendments are not successful, that they won't insist on those amendments and they'll allow the bill to pass. And that's very important because I don't think this bill should be delayed by unnecessary amendments. I think it should be enacted as soon as possible so the federal government can have the power that most Australians thought it would have had already.
Well, that's a good attitude from Anthony Albanese and federal Labor, and got to give them credit for that. But it points to a bit of a split in Labor, doesn't it? Because Daniel Andrews and Victorian Labor are defending their Belt and Road initiative. You don't want to preempt which agreements might be overturned by Canberra, but obviously that one's in centre frame. Do you fear then that if the federal government tries to overturn Victoria's agreement, that Daniel Andrews and the Victorian government could challenge these laws, could challenge whatever the federal government does all the way to the High Court?
That is a very real risk, Chris. I hope it wouldn't happen, and I think if he did, on my layman's reading of the Constitution, he would clearly fail, because this very clearly is a power set out by our framers in 1901 for the federal government and the federal government only. It doesn't contemplate state governments freelancing and engaging in their own foreign relations. But you're right, Daniel Andrews is very isolated on this. Not only does he not have the support of federal Labor, but there's no other state or territory leader in the country, whether they are Liberal or Labor, who've entered into such arrangements. And many other Labor leaders have said they would never enter into such arrangements. So he really is isolated on this. It really is an extreme and unviable position for him to adopt. And I'm amazed that he's stuck to it despite all the criticism, despite all the well-publicised concern of the federal government. Clearly he thinks he knows better how to manage Australia's foreign relations than the federal government does. But really, if that is his view, well, then he should run for federal parliament, and he can try and convince his federal Labor colleagues that they're wrong. He can have an argument with Penny Wong that she's wrong, and that state governments should be allowed to freelance on foreign policy.
Careful what you wish for. Now, finally, what about the consequences for the relationship with China? I don't for a moment suggest that we should back down on this. It's a sensible law, but it will increase the temperature between Canberra and Beijing.
It might increase the temperature, Chris, but if you look at this issue on its merits, as the federal government is looking at all of these issues on their merits, it's really hard to understand why any foreign government would object to the idea that Australia's federal government should be in charge of our foreign policy. That really would be quite an unreasonable intervention in our domestic political affairs, in our domestic politics, in our domestic policy settings, that we would never do to another country, and we would hope that no other country would do to us. And it would be instructive, Chris, if the Chinese Communist Party did object to this, because as far as I'm aware, there's no other government in the world that has objected to this, that has raised concerns about this. No other country has said they would like to engage in foreign relations with our state governments, or indeed our local councils, or indeed our universities. All the other governments are either indifferent about this or agree with Australia that, of course, our federal government should be in charge of determining what's in the national interest and no one else.
Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.